School reunions are fascinating events, bringing people together from all walks of life to reconnect with classmates they haven't seen in years and to showcase how life has treated them since. What is the worst thing that has happened at a high school reunion party that you attended? Welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Story 1. My 10-year high school reunion and my husband's fell on the same weekend, so we decided to attend his. It seemed better organized and more fun, plus it was a chance to visit a place we hadn't been to in a while. The main event was a 2-hour party cruise on a small boat, preceded by lunch, happy hour bar hopping, and ending with an after-party for those who wanted to stay out late. It sounded like a great plan, on paper. The first problem was logistics. The lake where the boat was docked was 45 minutes away from most attendees' homes, and everyone had to arrange their own transportation. Carpooling seemed like a good solution, but some groups decided to pre-game in their cars, leading to police pulling people over for drunk driving or littering empty beer cans on the highway. And this was all happening in broad daylight. Next, the pre-cruise activities turned into a financial mess. Everyone was responsible for their own tabs at lunch and happy hour, but some people racked up huge bills under the name of the class reunion and then ghosted. The restaurant and bars were furious, detaining anyone who claimed to be part of the reunion until police arrived. My husband and I missed most of this drama since we joined late, but we left quickly after paying for our drinks, avoiding the chaos. Later, I heard some of the venues even considered suing the school over the unpaid tabs. The boat was small, with limited space. An enclosed main area, tiny decks on the front and back, a narrow walkway along the sides, and an off-limits sublevel. There was only one bathroom for men and one for women. By the time we boarded, most people were already drunk. The evening started with an awkward attempt at speeches and a "Where Are They Now" segment, but the designated MC was one of the people stopped for drunk driving, another organizer was stuck dealing with the bar fiasco, and a third was already vomiting. Someone else stepped in, fumbled a tribute to deceased classmates with tasteless jokes, and quit in frustration. Soon, people found a boombox, and the party devolved into drinking and dancing. The snacks, bright blue frosted baked goods in school colors, and drinks, a pink concoction of lemonade powder, Sprite, and vodka, didn't help matters. About an hour into the cruise, people started getting violently ill. Roughly 30 out of 70 attendees were vomiting or experiencing severe stomach issues, likely from contaminated snack. With only 2 bathrooms, people were throwing up into anything they could find or, unfortunately, onto the floor. Those of us who weren't sick crammed onto the deck to escape the stench. While on the deck, I chatted with some of my husband's friends when a guy I didn't recognize approached me, making cheesy pickup lines. Jokingly, I played along, pretending we'd been childhood sweethearts and prom king and queen. Everyone laughed, and he eventually left, saying he'd get us drinks as an apology. My husband joined us later and told me some guy was bragging about taking home a hot chick, which we dismissed as drunken bravado. A bit later, the same guy returned and tried to physically pull me away, claiming I was his girl. When my husband intervened, the guy backed down, handed out drinks, and disappeared again. Shortly after, I started feeling dizzy and nauseous. I left to get air but collapsed against the railing. The last thing I remember was the guy reappearing and dragging me toward the sublevel door before I blacked out. Thankfully, a friend noticed I was missing and found me unconscious with the guy knocked out nearby, likely from falling and hitting his head when I went limp. I later woke up in the hospital, where doctors told me I'd been made unconscious. They also treated me for seizures and severe allergic reactions. Meanwhile, over half the boat contracted norovirus from the baked goods. The guy was arrested and charged with multiple crimes. He ended up pleading down to lesser charges and served just 9 weeks in jail, despite facing potentially decades-long sentences if convicted of the original felonies. Between the norovirus outbreak, financial chaos, and my near-traumatic experience, it's safe to say I'll never attend a reunion again. The entire ordeal was like a nightmare, and I avoid going back to that area altogether. Story 2. At my 10-year high school reunion, we had a decent turnout, maybe 100+ people. We were at a pretty nice hotel banquet hall. There was one guy I had known all through high school, and he was a well-known stoner. I'll call him Chris for this story. I see Chris walk into the banquet hall, stop in his tracks, turn around in a very slow 360-degree circle, surveying the entire room. He just says, "Whoa," and he looks visibly alarmed. He stops and his eyes settle on me. I say, "Hey Chris, long time no see, man." He kind of slides over to me and whispers in my ear, "This is really weird. I'm pretty sure I know every single person in this room." And that is when I realize he is wearing the same clothes as all the banquet hall workers. Oh my God. Chris is working as a server at his own high school reunion, and he has no clue what is happening. I walked him out to the front lobby and explained it's our 10-year high school reunion. He is mortified beyond embarrassed. He was never contacted, and didn't even realize it had been 10 years since we graduated. He just knew he was working on another catering gig in a never-ending series of catering gigs. I made him take me to his manager. I explain what is happening and tell the manager there is no way this guy is working his own high school reunion. Awesomely, the manager agrees. We find a different suit jacket and tie for him, and I take Chris back to the party. He ended up having a good night. Story 3. At our 5-year reunion, one guy, who was always a bit of an underdog in high school, but a nice person, got into a conversation and suddenly pulled out his paycheck, loudly saying, "Now do you think I'm a loser? And don't believe how much I make? Check this out." Naturally, it just made things more awkward, and everyone ended up laughing at him. I mean, who brings their paycheck to a reunion? Haven't seen him since. Story 4. At our reunion, the former valedictorian, who was visibly pregnant, ended up doing drugs in the bathroom. Rumor has it meth. Things spiraled from there. She became convinced that her husband was trying to hook up with another woman at the reunion, so she refused to leave despite his attempts to calm her down. Eventually, her friends and husband managed to get her outside to cool off, but that wasn't the end of it. A couple of hours later, she was called to the stage to give a speech. Instead of the usual nostalgic or inspirational words, she went completely off the rails. She started spilling every dirty little secret and high school rumor she could remember, airing everyone's dirty laundry in front of the entire reunion. Long-term couples who had been together since high school were suddenly fighting, and the room was in chaos. I had transferred to the school my senior year and barely knew her. I had only shared one class with her, and I flunked it from sleeping through it all year, so I was thankfully spared. But the popular kids weren't so lucky. They got absolutely dragged. Watching it all unfold was like witnessing a train wreck. You couldn't look away, but it was brutal. Story 5. At my 10-year reunion, the organizers were handing out awards for things like the person who traveled the farthest, the person with the most kids, and so on. When they announced the award for the person with the oldest child, everyone started shouting out their kids' ages. The room quieted down, and this shy girl near the front simply said, 11. That's when it hit us all. We finally understood why we hadn't seen Heather in the months leading up to graduation. Story 6. When I was in 7th grade, this rich, arrogant bully named John yanked a wool scarf off my head that my mother had knitted for me. He then threw it into a pile of muddy leaves and stomped on it. When I got home and my mother saw the torn, dirty scarf, she was furious. She insisted I tell her who did it, and then she called the school principal to let him have it. The next day, John was pulled into the principal's office and paddled. This was back when they still did that. Fast forward 55 years to our 50th class reunion, and John stormed up to me, clearly still upset. "You got me into trouble in 7th grade, he yelled. I was baffled. He was still holding a grudge after all these years? I looked at him and said, "John, you were a jerk in high school, and you're still a jerk," then turned and walked away. Story 7. A few years after graduation, my core group of friends from college decided to meet up for a small reunion. We had all partied pretty hard during school, but by our late 20s, we had mellowed out. So we decided to grab dinner at a local bar/restaurant, think something like Applebee's, but a little nicer. One guy showed up already drunk, carrying a duffel bag stuffed with multiple packets of weed and the bottle he had started on before meeting us. He quickly decided we were boring, finished off his bottle in the restroom, and refused to come out. We later found him passed out in there. The bartender kicked him out, but he had come alone in an Uber, and none of us knew where he lived. He was angry, puking, and belligerent, so none of us wanted to take him home. In the end, we dropped him off at his last known address, his parents' house. It was past midnight, and his parents answered the door. We awkwardly handed him over, and then just bolted. Safe to say, he's not invited to the next reunion. Story 8. At my 20-year reunion, a guy from our class made an offhand comment to a girl we graduated with. This girl had always struck me as someone who seemed to have it all, super skinny and pretty, straight A's, stylish clothes. But behind the scenes, she had a rough home life. I didn't know until years after high school that she'd been abused by her mom, who was apparently pretty unhinged. At the reunion, the comment didn't seem to bother her much, but her husband, who was drunk, got really angry and started making a scene. She tried to calm him down, begging him to just let it go, but it escalated quickly. Before long, they were screaming at each other in front of everyone. Later, I heard from one of her friends that she's in a terrible marriage. I didn't press for details, but the whole situation still makes me feel awful for her. It's hard knowing someone who already went through so much is stuck in another bad situation. Story 9. It's been a decade since I graduated, and every so often I run into an old classmate when he's doing maintenance work in my apartment building. About a year ago, he asked if I was going to the reunion some of our classmates were organizing. I told him no because honestly, I couldn't think of anything worse, and I hadn't even been invited. Apparently, they were organizing it on Facebook, but I don't use Facebook. 6 months later, I ran into him again and asked how the reunion went. He sighed and explained that it had turned into a complete disaster. The mean girls had initially started planning it together, but then they had a falling out and ended up planning their own separate event. In the end, there were about 4 awkward, tiny parties and no one knew where to go. Story 10. The people who were supposed to plan our high school reunion completely dropped the ball, so I figured it wasn't going to happen. But then, out of nowhere, this guy from our high school stepped up to organize it. He was in a grad program and working part-time at a banquet hall, and he offered to get us the space for free. It was a nice gesture, and he seemed genuinely excited about it. He'd been pretty miserable in high school, grumpy, sullen, and mean to others. He came out in college, so maybe the pressure of hiding who he was had played a role in how unpleasant he'd been. Maybe he'd be different now. At the time, I was stuck in a dead-end job with no savings, so I wasn't really looking forward to being pitted by my classmates or spending much money to attend. Plus, there was a chance my awful ex might show up, and that didn't sound worth it. The organizer made a Facebook event and asked people to send him money via Venmo in advance, somewhere between $15 to $20, I think. Honestly, it didn't seem worth paying for. Maybe if drinks were included, I'd consider going for an hour. I messaged him privately to ask what the ticket covered. Was it food, drinks? The space was free, after all. He then posted publicly that if the cost was too steep, people could message him for financial aid. So I posted a public question asking the same thing. Other people did too. Finally, he said the money would cover a bartender, a server, and food. Fair enough. Turns out, he was the server. My friend showed up, having not paid him yet, and he refused to let her in. Those who had paid entered an empty banquet hall, and he handed them menus, telling them to order food and drinks from him. He pocketed the admission money as his tip. After an hour, he brought out one grocery store sheet cake for 75 people to share. That was it. Story 11. At my 10-year high school reunion, things didn't go as planned. Our graduating class had about 850 students, and the school had a healthy trust fund set aside for reunions. A good friend of mine was the treasurer and took charge of organizing everything through Facebook. We started off big, a ballroom with a capacity for 1,000 people. We thought that would cover everyone plus spouses. A year out, there was a lot of interest. Definitely not 1,000 people, but enough to make us scale back a little. 6 months out, the interest dropped. People had reconnected on Facebook, but many lost the motivation to actually attend. So, we cut the scale back even more. 3 months out, we had deadlines to confirm attendance. The school's alumni association would release funds based on the class size and the milestone anniversary. But we hadn't put a deposit down yet because we kept waiting to see how many people would commit. 2 months out, my friend had to finalize everything and set a hard cutoff date. She'd been taking late sign-ups for weeks due to the lack of interest. The day of the reunion arrived, and instead of a ballroom, it was held at a local bar. Not a small bar, though. It had good food, and we rented the whole place for a Friday night. Out of the 150 people who RSVP'd, about 25 alumni showed up, with maybe 40 people total when you added spouses and others. It was a little sad knowing so few people cared, but it was also hilarious seeing my friend, the treasurer, smirking the whole time. The school had allocated $50 per person plus guest. $15,000 total, with the instruction to cover everything. We ate and drank so much it almost felt like a Roman feast. The total bill ended up being $7,500 for food and the venue rental. Afterward, my friend paid the bill, then handed everyone $100 from the envelope. She passed the rest of the money, about $3,000, to the manager as a tip for the staff. It wasn't a total disaster, but it was a bit of a wake-up call. People just don't care about reunions like they used to. Story 12. At our 20-year reunion, one classmate had made not one, but 2 fortunes. He'd amassed a net worth of over $100 million by that point, thanks to high-speed modem patents from the late 1980s and being an early investor in broadband. He was in the right place at the right time. By then, he had already retired. For the class update bulletin, he humorously listed his occupation as unemployed and unemployable, as a joke. Despite the obvious humor, a few well-meaning but clueless classmates still sought him out to offer career advice and tips on how to find work. Story 13. This didn't happen to me, but I had a friend who got someone pregnant years ago. The mother kept the child, and while my friend has always helped financially, that was the extent of his involvement. She married soon after high school and met a great guy who has been the child's de facto dad. At a Bring Your Kids If You Have Them event, someone accidentally let it slip that my friend was the biological father. The kid overheard, and it was an absolute disaster. People were scrambling to figure out who said it and how the secret got out. In the end, my friend acted surprised and laughed it off as a joke. Honestly, in front of the kid, it was probably the best way to handle it. Story 14. In high school, we had a teacher who once told us, by the time you hit your 10-year reunion, at least one of your classmates will have passed away, during a conversation about mortality. Fast forward to our 10-year reunion, and nobody from our class had died. That Saturday night, we were partying and having a great time. One of the organizers got up to make some announcements, and suddenly, she froze, a blank look on her face, before collapsing to the floor. It was a brain aneurysm. She was gone before she even hit the ground. Story 15. At our 20-year reunion, 2 guys got arrested for fighting outside the bar we were at on Friday night. Why were they fighting? One of the guys brought up a fling from high school. He had slept with the other guy's girlfriend back then. The thing is, neither of them had married her or even dated her after high school. But somehow, 20 years later, they were both still throwing punches over her. Story 16. We'd been at the reunion less than an hour, having a great time catching up, when an old friend came up to me and said, "Is that your wife over there? She's pretty hammered." We looked over just in time to see her trip and faceplant into a 12-top table where a bunch of my old classmates were sitting. The table collapsed, food and drinks went everywhere, and I rushed over to scoop her up. Half carrying, half walking her out the door, I realized she had taken Xanax before the event, which I didn't know about, and was an alcoholic who started drinking heavily as soon as we got there. So yeah, good times. Story 17. The class officers organized a 5-year reunion over Thanksgiving weekend at a local bar. They only invited the people they liked, around 30 to 40 folk. One person they didn't invite had become a police officer, and he managed to talk his supervisor into setting up a DUI checkpoint that night. Almost half the people who showed up ended up in jail. 2 of the event organizers were even arrested for drug charges and DWIs. The 10-year reunion started out better, but quickly turned into another disaster. They decided to host a picnic at the same place as our senior picnic. One of the class officers had started a catering company and gave themselves the job of catering the event. About a third of the attendees ended up with food poisoning. Fortunately, the 20-year reunion got cancelled due to COVID, sparing us from what could have been another chaotic event. Story 18. No one showed up. I attended my 10-year reunion, but it was in a really small town, so my graduating class only had 27 people. In the end, only 4 people showed up, and one of them was actually homeschooled. It was pretty disappointing. I was looking forward to reconnecting and had traveled 3,000 miles to get there. It left me feeling a bit jaded about my classmate. I'm not upset, just more aware that there wasn't really a lasting connection after all. Story 19. I went to my partner's 5-year reunion at the local Elks Lodge. He grew up in a wealthy town, so the event was pretty extravagant. The highlight was definitely the open bar until 9 p.m., after which it switched to cash only. Everyone was having a great time, until some jerk snuck into the basement and swiped a bunch of booze, literally multiple boxes. When the bartenders found out around 8:30, they were furious and kicked us all out. It really ruined what could have been an awesome night. Story 20. When the invite for my 10-year reunion came, I thought, yeah, this could be fun. Then I saw the venue was a fancy restaurant, which was a bit of a letdown. I was expecting more of a party atmosphere. The space was tiny, over 100 people in our class, yet the venue could only hold about 25. I reached out to all the friends I've kept in touch with, but none of them were interested in going. My old high school best friend suggested we catch up at his place instead. Haven't seen him in years, so I decided to skip the reunion. Turns out, almost no one showed up. One of the girls who helped organize it was begging my friend to go because she was so embarrassed by how few people had RSVP'd. She ended up canceling too. Of the 10 people who did attend, half of whom had organized it, they had to be split into separate tables because the venue wasn't even big enough for a large group. It wasn't the first time this group had messed things up. They also planned our end-of-school formal, prom, deciding unilaterally to change everything without consulting anyone else. It got so bad that a lot of people bailed, and they had to invite dropouts, transfers, and even expelled students just to meet the venue's minimum capacity. Honestly, I should have known better than to expect much from their reunion. But apparently, the after-party was a wild mess. Someone nearly got thrown off the boat into the water at 2 a.m., and a guy I know ended up with less than pleasant injury. Story 21. My sister, my now husband, and I all graduated together, along with my husband's best friend. His best friend's name was something like John Smith, a very common name. He was super popular in high school, a really nice guy who always stood out in a crowd. If you didn't know him, you definitely knew of him, even in such a big school. So, the 20-year reunion rolls around, and my sister is the only one who really wanted to go. She calls right after, totally upset. Apparently, there was a huge memorial wall dedicated to John Smith, who had just passed away. We had no idea. It was awful. My husband was like, "Wait, what? We just saw him." So he calls him up and says, "Hey man, are you dead?" Turns out, he was fine. Not dead at all. Just really surprised by the whole thing. Turns out, the much less popular John Smith was the one who had actually passed. They had put up a memorial for the wrong guy, who was completely forgotten in the process. To this day, we still run into people who see him and say, "Hey, aren't you supposed to be dead?" Story 22. This wasn't my reunion, but it was my husband's. For the 10-year reunion, the whole thing was poorly organized and it was pretty clear that most of the class wasn't interested in getting together. The venue kept changing every couple of weeks, updated through a Facebook group. At first, they planned on renting a place and having food catered. However, since it's pretty typical in my town for most people not to be well off, asking a bunch of unemployed or minimum wage workers to pay around $200 to attend just didn't fly. The venues kept downgrading until they settled on a bonfire by the lake. Bring your own bottle, no fee, just show up and hang out for an hour or so. Throughout all the venue changes, most of the class ended up backing out. A lot of people never bothered to update their RSVP status, and some even forgot to mark that they were no longer attending. Only 2 people showed up. One was my brother, who didn't have anything else to do. The other was a guy who sort of helped put the whole mess together. The girl who organized it was really upset about the turnout, and the guy posted a long rant on Facebook about how unappreciative everyone was, saying they should have recognized the effort it took to pull off such a sad event. After everything was said and done, my husband had me flip through the Facebook group. It was clear that the organizer was in complete denial the entire time, even though it was obvious no one wanted to go. I had a good laugh at the rant, but honestly, I forgot about it until I saw this thread. Edit. I should mention that my brother and husband were in the same graduating class and were good friends throughout high school, college, and still are today. I'm a little younger, so I wasn't part of the reunion. And no, my husband didn't go. He just checked out everyone's Facebook profiles and figured that was enough. Plus, we had just moved out of state, so traveling wasn't a priority. Story 23. At our 10-year reunion, a girl confessed to cheating on her high school sweetheart, thinking enough time had passed that it wouldn't bother him. She was wrong. They hadn't seen each other in years. As far as I know, they broke up shortly after high school ended. When she casually mentioned it, he lost it. He slapped her and then started screaming at her. She ran off, and then he broke down, saying something about wasting his high school years before storming off himself. Despite the chaos, we still managed to have a good time after all of that, which was a relief. Story 24. I wasn't sure why I went to my high school reunion. Most of the friends I kept in touch with were the ones I still stayed in touch with, but one friend managed to convince me to go. The event wasn't terrible. It was mostly people trying their best to one-up each other, showcasing their success in a subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, way. I sat at a table next to my friend, enjoying catching up with old acquaintances. During the reunion, there were 2 people who stood out the most. One was a woman I barely recognized. My friend and I kept asking each other if she was in our class or if she was a spouse of someone. We later found out she had spent nearly $80,000 on cosmetic surgery to the point that she was practically unidentifiable. She was so proud that no one could recognize her. Honestly, she could have been on a show like Botched, but who was I to burst her bubble? The other person who stood out was a guy who had been incredibly snooty in high school, the kind of person who wouldn't even acknowledge you if you didn't live in the right neighborhood. He showed up late to the dinner, and all the seats at his old friend's table were taken. So, he ended up sitting at our table, the people he had looked down on for years. I felt a little bad for him, especially since most of the table ignored him, so I decided to ask him questions about what he'd been up to since graduation. It was hard to hear over the loud music, but we made do. I asked him about his job, and he mentioned working at a law firm. When I asked if he was a lawyer, he said no, but he was working on it. I pressed further, asking if he was articling, and he replied, no. Finally, In a moment of frustration, with the DJ suddenly cutting the music for an announcement, he blurted out, "I'm a mailroom clerk." The silence that followed was golden. I hate to admit it, but it was like accidental justice. He'd been taken down a peg or two by his own words. Story 25. At my high school reunion, someone confessed to me that I was his dream girl, while his fiancée was his date. I barely knew the guy back in high school, but apparently, he'd been holding on to this idea for a while. Unfortunately for his fiancée, she didn't know anyone at the event, and he refused to leave with her. Drunk and belligerent, he slurred, "I'm not leaving with her, I'm leaving with you." I felt bad for her, so I told her to text me when their car was outside. Then, I whispered "let's go" in his ear, walked him outside, and literally put him in her car. The look on his face when he realized who was behind the wheel was priceless. I just said, "Yeah, that's how tonight is going to end." But, somehow, they still got married. Story 26. This wasn't my reunion, it was my husband's. In high school, my husband was and still is a quiet, reserved guy. He doesn't tolerate any BS, which is why I call him my John Wayne. He's also 6 years older than me. We arrive at the venue and people are mingling. Suddenly, a woman calls out his name and rushes over. He introduces me, and she completely loses it. Apparently, she had been in love with him since elementary school but had never said anything, and she had planned to ask him out that night. What she didn't know was that he was married, and that I was 7 months pregnant. She starts crying hysterically and yelling at me, incoherently. It turned out she was living with bipolar disorder, and had struggled with addiction at the time, which explained her over-the-top reaction. We didn't stick around long after that. Less than 20 minutes after arriving, we decided to leave. Story 27. At our 5-year reunion, one guy had a three-way with my best friend and another girl. It wasn't the worst thing, but he was in a relationship at the time, and I had to hear all about the details from my best friend afterward. Apparently, his dong was much smaller than anticipated. Truly terrible. Story 28. I decided to go to my reunion, even though high school had been a complete disaster for me. I was the self-conscious girl who would jump at the slightest conversation. But I'd grown out of that by then, so I figured, why not go and see who I could talk to now? I spent the night chatting with people I'd never talked to before because of the whole high school clique thing. Turned out to be a great time, until one guy decided to get blind drunk. He picked a fight with another guy for no reason, and in the chaos, they both crashed into me, sending all of us tumbling into a table, which broke on impact. I didn't break anything, thank goodness for my extra padding, but I ended up with some intense bruising along my torso and hips, plus a bruise across my right cheekbone. The cops were called, and the drunk guy got arrested. The guy he fought with was taken in too, though not under arrest. I ended up at the hospital, and had to take a few days off work to recover. I also had to learn how to apply concealer, since I worked in customer service at the time. The drunk guy's wife was kind enough to pay me back for my hospital bill though. Story 29. I was one of the first recipients of an alumni scholarship from the class of 1999, and for their 20th reunion, the guy who organized the scholarship reached out to ask if I would come as his guest and give a speech encouraging people to donate. I now live about an hour away, but I felt pressured and thought, sure, why not? After all, I benefited from the scholarship, so it felt like a good way to pay it forward. He also convinced me to make a symbolic donation of $10, which, to be honest, is not nothing to me. I wrote a speech, practiced, made note cards, and headed out. When I arrived at the hotel, the party was in the front lounge, packed with people who were at least 10 years older than me. I found the guy, and he started introducing me but kept getting the details of my life wrong every time. I asked when I'd be speaking, and he said, later, and told me to enjoy the food. The only problem? It was all meat and I don't eat that. He disappeared. By chance, I ran into a guy who used to work at my old community theater. I clung to him for dear life, not wanting to be alone. He probably wanted to catch up with others, but instead, we talked for an hour. I found the guy again and asked when I'd be speaking. He said soon, but I realized there was no stage, just the party spread across the lobby. He pointed to the DJ booth, where a slideshow of everyone's high school pictures was playing behind a girl no one knew or particularly cared about. Fantastic. Another hour passed, and it was time for the group picture. Everyone gathered for it, and I stayed nearby, waiting. As people asked who I was with, I kept saying, I'm giving a speech. They'd ask when, and I'd say soon. Then, a loud band started playing at an adjacent party, and people started shouting just to be heard. That's when I realized, I may not actually give my speech. I found the guy one last time, smirking, and asked, when am I giving my speech? He said, utterly guileless, it looks like you don't have to. But I hope you had fun. I got home at midnight, speech still in my purse, and haven't heard from him since. Story 30. I was invited to my 5-year reunion a few years ago. I went to a pretty small, rural school, and my graduating class had about 90 people. Honestly, I hated almost everyone I went to school with, so I didn't go. But every time I left the group chat, they just kept adding me back, so eventually I blocked everyone. From what I heard from a friend who went at the last minute, it was a complete disaster. They had a huge bonfire out in the middle of nowhere, and the cool kids from high school decided to smoke everyone out while showing off their big diesel trucks. Most people got absolutely wasted, and a bunch of them started shooting guns while drunk. The best part was when one of the cool guys, who was already pretty dumb in high school, thought it would be hilarious to toss a full propane tank into the bonfire. As soon as my friend saw that, he decided to leave. I have no idea if anyone got hurt, but I wouldn't be surprised if they did. 5 years isn't enough to change people, and I'll never attend another reunion. Story 31. At our 10-year reunion for the class of 2005, the second night was the big formal event. It had everything: catered food, a rented venue, an open bar, a live band, you name it. People were really letting loose, and the open bar definitely helped. As I kept going back and forth for drinks, I started to get this nagging feeling that I recognized the bartender from somewhere. A few of my friends felt the same way, so on my next trip to the bar, I decided to bring it up. I asked, "Hey, don't I know you from somewhere?" He looked me straight in the eye and said, "Yeah, I was part of the graduating class. I didn't even get an invite." It hit me like a ton of bricks. The guy had been hired to bartend his own reunion, a reunion he wasn't even invited to. The poor guy just stood there, cool as ever, serving drinks while the rest of us partied it up. It was hands down the worst accidental mistake I've ever been a part of, and now I'm the jerk who recognized him just enough to bring it up. Story 32. Our reunion started off pretty well. A group of people who'd been outcasts in high school, always a little rough around the edges, had seemingly done just fine for themselves in the years since. Or so we thought. The night took a wild turn when one guy from their group, whom everyone had assumed was gay, got drunk and confessed that he had only pretended to be gay in high school. His reason? To get close to the wife of the guy who had hooked up with his prom date back then. The kicker? It wasn't even the right guy. The person he was targeting wasn't the one who'd been with his prom date. It was actually his own best friend. Back in high school, that friend had been the more attractive one, though he'd since gained a lot of weight. Furious at being outed in such an embarrassing way, the best friend caused a scene and somehow got everyone's drink tickets confiscated by the venue. That didn't sit well with a group of rowdy guys, who decided to drag him and his friend off to the bathroom for some old-school justice, wedge style, just like in high school. Meanwhile, another member of their group, who had since become a priest and was clearly trying to distance himself from their antics, ended up getting caught stealing people's jewelry. At that point, the entire group was kicked out of the reunion. But it wasn't over. They managed to sneak back in, commandeered the mic from the MC, and proceeded to perform the most bizarre, drunken group dance you could imagine. The formerly better-looking friend ripped off his shirt mid-performance and started screaming incoherently. That was the nail in the coffin for the reunion. Most people left right after, with the venue littered with broken beer bottles in the parking lot, courtesy of this chaotic group. Safe to say, the night didn't end on a high note. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.